Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Today, I want to talk about the history of modern Discipline Priest, where it really started in Legion, but we're even going to go further back than that to talk about where the spec has been, how it's developed over the years, and some of the things I have absolutely loved. I want to start it off in Mist of Pandaria because this sets some of the groundwork, and it was also the first time that I ended up playing Discipline. This was the height of their strength with crazy value out of Spirit Shell, and a little before I got into streaming or content creation. So we wanted to get a little highlight on the skill Divinity because he uses it to absolute perfection with these massive shields that you would generate out of Spirit Shell. And it actually worked off of Prayer of Healing, if you can believe it. You would utilize Spirit Shell, then hit 2 Prayer of Healings at least to cap out the strength of those absorbs onto each party, because Prayer of Healing was actually party based back then, and you would build up these juicer shields onto the entire raid and soak the entirety of the damage that people would have. There were some really cool fights in Siege of Orgrimmar in particular, especially on Garrosh with the huge damage from like the Iron Stars, but even other encounters on that massively benefited from the shields. It was the most insane version of Disc Priest I think that's ever existed. Your single target shield was really powerful, and it also would often act as like a mana dump if you had a lot of extra mana. And so you had Rapture actually as a passive where every 14-15 seconds you could have one shield that gets fully absorbed and it would regen its mana back to you. And so you would kind of keep an eye on the internal cooldown tracker of Rapture to always make sure that you're getting those free shields utilized for your team. Atonement was also a smart heal in that it was going to heal the most injured player in your group as you were dealing damage. And so you could just be smiting and penancing the boss, dealing tons of damage and converting it into really effective healing on whoever needed it most. You didn't have to apply Atonement to anybody back in the day. And this is also in the talents. Halo, Divine Star, and Cascade were added into the game, and all of them were very strong. Like, you could think not quite Archon Holy Priest right now, but something similar to that, way stronger than you ever had since that point. They nerfed it heavily after Mist of Pandaria. You could even have the entire raid stacked in Divine Star and then just whip your Divine Star through the group. And since it was the end of the expansion with Siege of Orgrimmar when I started playing, you had a lot of haste and you also had a lot of crit. And Divine Aegis, which notably your crit heals would make shields, was way more powerful back then as well. And again, just another way you could start soaking up all of the damage. And so in this vein, it was coming from a perspective of like kind of ramping or setting up these mass absorbs onto everything. And it was really the first experience I had with setting up in advance for damage, since my first healer was a paladin. And so coming into playing Disc, I felt like I had to be even more preemptive than I had ever had anything prior. It was amazing. Warlords had a pretty unfortunate downturn, in my view, for Disc Priest design. They got rid of the smart healing out of Atonement, and it was healing what you might call semi-smart, where it was healing uninjured target, but not the most injured target, so overheal could happen. It was also very weak Atonement healing relative to what we had out of Mist of Pandaria, and it felt really half-baked. The pre-patch of Warlords of Draenor, so still Mist of Pandaria, had this like Holy Nova build where all you did was just mash Holy Nova, because they were like reworking the spec, trying to get away from the smart heals, trying to get away from like the mass absorbs that Spirit Shell brought to the table. That was when they pruned it, was going into Warlords. And so the spec had like no identity really. It felt like you would just mash out shields and you'd produce healing because shields were super effective, right? They even gave an additional shield with the clarity talents. Each of the healers had a like clarity that they could utilize for priest, and Shadow had like clarity of power, which was like the dot weaving setup. So I actually ended up playing Shadow, Holy, and Disc in Mythic High Mall progression. And actually my first kill of Imperator Margok was me playing Shadow. It's like one of my oldest videos on my YouTube channel. It was crazy. Dot weaving was not a blast. But on the side of Disc Priest, Clarity of Will was this ability where you would actually cast this long, like 1.5-second cast, and it would steadily build up absorbs on your target. And so you had Power Word Shield for individual shields, and then you can also just mash big shields onto one other person at a time with Clarity of Will. And it was actually pretty clutch on the Margok encounter, because it was like the Disc Priest, and I think we had like the Hunter had to run out for some of the mechanics on the encounter, and so like just having those shields while everyone else was stacked for healing, it gave you that extra bit of self-sustain to keep everybody alive. Disc also still had Prayer of Healing in Warlords of Draenor, and so you'd get some extra Divine Aegis shielding from it. This is an area I kind of lost faith in Disc early on, because it kind of lost its identity in my mind about like more heavily setting up for its healing and just kind of casting shields all day. It's wild to think what you remembered from playing games almost 8, 9, or 10 years ago. And that's why our sponsor, Boot.dev, is using games to be able to teach back-end web development from start to finish in both Python and Go's programming languages. They know, just like with WoW, that the best way to learn is by doing, and so they get you writing a ton of code from the very beginning, because they realize you can't learn to code without writing a ton of it and building some real projects along the way. They know that when learning something new, boredom is the enemy, and that's why they've used tools from modern game design to weave into back-end web development instruction to make sure that you're able to never be bored and stick to your goals. To track your progress on your learning journey, they have XP, levels, achievements, quests to get you a top spot on those global leaderboards. They also have bi-monthly boss fights where the community can rally together and gain bonus XP for each lesson completed during the event. All of their content is free on their site to read and watch in guest mode. The paid membership unlocks all the interactive features like the hands-on coding, AI assistance, progress tracking, and the game elements to keep you engaged along your journey. So there's never been a better time to try it out for yourself and see if it's right for you. So check out Boot.dev and use my code AutomaticJak to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. Thanks so much to Boot.dev for sponsoring this video, and let's continue. Modern Discipline Priest really got its legs in Legion. It was an incredibly rough start as they were trying to redesign the entire spec from the ground up, like a lot of specs really in Legion. The modern Holy Priest with the Holy Word system also got its start out in Legion. So to begin with, they wanted to make sure in Legion that you were manually applying atonements to set yourself up for healing rather than just absorbing everything. So the spec was trying to take a pivot out of the absorb meta and into direct healing. As a result, they started removing a few different abilities from Disc in general, moving him to Holy or moving him to Shadow, and giving Discipline Priest powered Radiance to apply atonement to 3 allies at the very beginning of Legion, but they had 15-second atonements and there was no cooldown. They also had an ability called Plea, and you could kind of think of it as a modern Renew, but it did a tiny amount of healing and then applied 1 atonement. It also increased in mana cost with the amount of atonements that you had out, quickly leading to the spec just eating mana like crazy at the very start of the expansion. You basically would just get Innervate and mash Radiances like crazy, start doing some damage, and boom, profit. That being said, the spec was really dependent early on actually having that external mana in order to produce some like half decent healing along the way. This was also the beginning of getting Light's Wrath, our artifact appearance. This was doing absurd amounts of damage. Like if you play back in Dragonflight at the beginning and we had Light's Wrath, that was awful damage compared to what it was in Legion. It was just a raid-wide lay on hands that you could put out onto your allies, producing absurd numbers with that artifact. The hidden appearance or the hidden effect was actually that it would light up and like fill with power in the open world, and then you could just like one-shot enemies so easily with a charged up Light's Wrath, having this projectile like fly through the air and just crush enemies when you're out questing in the world. Crazy insane. But 725 was what I would really call the beginning of what modern Discipline Priest is today. They added Evangelism as an atonement extender, and at the time it was really most akin to Flourish, and still basically is, right? On that final row of talents available to you, and this really allowed for your trinkets to start being tied in to your atonements. Instead of having just like a very narrow window of like really low atonement duration to be able to set up all your damage or set up a Light's Wrath, you now had that atonement extender out of Evangelism to help you along the way. And at the time in Legion, damage trinkets did convert into atonement healing. So the Owl trinket from the Tomb of Sargeras raid from the Sisters of the Moon fight was ridiculously good for Disc Priest. We called it the Hoot Hoot back in the day. This thing did absurd amounts of damage. You tied it into when you were extending the duration of all your atonements. You could blast huge amounts of damage. And this was also as the next round of legendaries were going to be coming out as well, which meant that Velen's Future Sight, the legendary trinket, also was coming into play, redirecting our overheal. A lot of times in the meta of like overall healing in Legion, there was a lot of overheal. Like healers could push up health pools absurdly fast, and if you're able to redirect that overheal, you could be like a lot sloppier with your ramps. You could be a lot sloppier with your gameplay. Even going back and looking at some of this gameplay myself, I was just like amazed at like some mistakes or timing that I would make, how, you know, players have improved over the years. And oh my gosh, when Legion Classic comes back, it's going to be biblical. I can't wait. I can't wait. This was also the point where they made it so that Radiance was applying atonements at a reduced duration. It was now hitting 5 targets with its atonements. It still did munch mana like crazy as a spec. You know, Plea was still costing tons and tons of mana. You also had a couple of fights back there where you would take advantage of the Clarity of Will, like I mentioned back in Warlords. This was that single target absorb stacker that you could put out onto allies. And back in, gosh, it was like Antorus, you had a fight called Veramathras, we called it Fuzzy Mattress, where you would actually need to like blast big absorbs onto whichever like the priority targets for like the mechanic was. It was a very boring fight for Disc Priest, unfortunately. Once you got like more gear, you could like try to personal and like paint up people through the problems and stuff, but it was always a lot safer if you had the Disc Priest mashing out big absorbs, and so that's what guilds often had us doing. But this was like the heyday in a lot of ways of like modern discipline. But dare I say, I feel like BFA actually made it a little bit better. Even though we lost out on to Light's Wrath as it, you know, went the way of other borrowed power abilities and went off into the sunset, there was a lot of really good things that I loved about discipline in Battle for Azeroth. So at the beginning, it was pretty light on the fun side since our haste was insanely low. We didn't get any essences or corruptions until later, but the spec did so much healing. I don't even know how it did this much healing, but BFA was the time that every single season start, the spec caught some like big atonement nerfs, and every single season it was like ridiculously strong. Okay, I can't even, like, I'm pretty sure if I'm not mistaken, Exorcist ran like 3 or 4 Disc Priests. Correct me if I'm wrong onto that one, and also make sure to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. But there was so much power at the beginning of the expansion with Disc Priest, they had to continuously be nerfing it. And this is also around the time that M+ started becoming a bit more in the picture. In Legion, you know, you would spam like Clarity of Will to keep everyone alive through the huge burst that would happen, but more people were really getting used to pushing high-end M+ when it came into BFA. And that's where the lack of balance between, you know, raids and Mythic Plus became a huge problem. This is where, you know, they would nerf Disc because it was obscenely powerful in raids, and they would basically nerf it from insanely powerful to like still very OP. But in a 5-man environment, you just couldn't push up health bars fast enough, and so you just often got left in the dust when it came to the M+ meta back then. That being said, the bright side with Raid was that you just freaking owned. Some of the early Azerite traits were like, okay, and the borrowed power, though, got a lot better over time. So did the balance, too. The beginning of BFA, you basically, like, never hit Penance unless you were also moving, because Penance was super insanely weak. It was just, like, Schism and Smite all the way down. But every single Smite, since you didn't have all these, like, stacking modifiers, you know, you didn't have, like, Shadow Covenant as we know it now, of, like, tying in your pet, making your abilities do shadow, all kinds of stuff like that, right? Didn't have all that stacking modifiers together. You basically just had your schism and lots of smites and squeezing out all the damage that you could. When it came to more of the borrowed power in BFA, essences were incredibly fun. There was like 5 or 6 really good essences that you could take advantage of. And so what essences were, where you had this major effect and then a minor effect. So you could only have one major, and when you had the major installed basically in your neck, you would also have the minor effect to go with it. So overcharged mana basically turned off your mana regen, and every successive cast provided a stack of additional healing. So as you applied all your individual atonements and everything like that, using your shield, using Shadowmend at the time, you would stack up this big, juicy, overcharged mana healing buff, extend the duration of your atonements, and then start blasting tons and tons of healing onto everybody. You also had some cool minor essences, which would even out health pools for you. They'd leech health from one guy and give it to another. That was called Vitality Conduit. You had Conflict and Strife, which was absurd because it just gave you verse. Unfortunately, you had to do a lot of PvP to get that one. They even had others like Well of Existence, which would store your overhealing, and it would be this little pancake floating orb thing, and then when you capped it, it would actually become its full-fledged globe, and you could start distributing all of that other healing to everybody. That was a really cool major essence, but it wasn't really that good to use because the major effect would basically allow you to single target heal somebody with the overheal. I remember trying to use this in dungeons too, and I tried to play a giga overheal build so I could actually lay on hands people periodically, but whenever you stopped overhealing, then you had no juice to utilize, and it got pretty bad pretty quick. That being said, the end of the expansion with corruptions, oh man, it was very fun. It wasn't as flashy as you might have expected from paladins who had the inescapable truth corruption, which would just give them cooldown reduction, and they'd spam holy shocks, which would trigger glimmer healing all over the place. We had a lot of haste and a lot of crit and a lot of stats, but that still felt amazing to utilize. And it also was really maybe the only point since the beginning of the expansion where the spec felt really good to play in a dungeon environment. It was the very beginning of the expansion when you had Blood Decay doing all the self-healing for you in BFA, and then it was the end of the expansion where you could really blast and feel very powerful along the way. Those times felt really good in Keys, to the point that you could actually blast good damage and actually meet some of those healing checks. But boy, were there some dungeons with some absolutely awful healing checks. I remember trying to do Temple of Sethralis, and it was this it was this snake in the middle, and you had to single target heal the snake, and you just can't do that as Disc Priest. It was bad. It was really bad. But man, so much of BFA was so fantastic and so fun, which is why it was kind of a head scratcher that they made so many changes going into Shadowlands. Shadowlands, of course, had a lot of problems, but chief among them was how much they added extra stuff, just add stuff for Disc Priest. And what I mean by that was by making it so that the Covenant abilities were so powerful, it reduced the strength of our smite, it reduced the strength of our other abilities, and so they felt really watered down by comparison. So to start off Shadowlands, you had Spirit Shell making a return, and so 100% of your atonement healing would convert into shielding onto your allies. And so with the 45 second Mind Games cooldown you would have, you could basically do huge blasts of damage, stack up huge shields onto everybody thanks to Mind Games, and if the target that you debuffed the enemy with Mind Games healed themselves, it triggered additional damage on top of it. And so you had both Hungering Destroyer and Sire Denathrius with healing effects, and so you would debuff Sire Denathrius as his clones were going to rush in, and when they hit the target they would heal the boss. You had the debuff on the boss, and so the shields get absorbed, and then they trigger the heal on the boss. Mind Games triggers the damage effect, and then it would juice up your shields even more to biblical proportions. You didn't need to do it to be able to get through phase 1, but my god, was that satisfying on that end. After Castle Nathria, that's when they specifically nerfed Spirit Shell. I think they also nerfed Mind Games as well, if I remember correctly. But they nerfed Spirit Shell from 100% of its atonement to, I want to say it was 75 or 80%. And I remember like really weighing when I was working on the guides of like, oh, are you going to be recommending Spirit Shell or not recommending it or going into evangelism instead? Because your legendaries at the time, both Spirit Shell would extend the duration of some of your atonements. Also, your Rapture shields would apply longer atonements. You get really good value there. A couple of different things like that, right? And turns out doing way less healing was the way to actually balance out utilizing Spirit Shell. So not only were we not running Spirit Shell in Sanctum of Domination, we were also not utilizing mind games either. So it was actually going into Boon of the Ascended, and this was really, really super fun. In some areas it was super fun, in some areas it was very frustrating, because at the time in Sanctum, that's when you did not have the additional cooldown reduction of some of the spec specific, or what was it, the covenant specific legendaries. So you didn't get additional cooldown reduction for it. So it was this like super long cooldown. I think it was like 3 minutes, and then it could get reduced down to like 1.5 minutes. But when you had it up, you felt obscenely powerful. Getting to blast out those Ascended Blasts, which replaced your smites. And there were points where we were doing Sylvanas progression, where like our primary healing cooldown or only healing cooldown was just Boon. And you would just have Boon and be blasting your face off. This is honestly really similar to what Voidweaver is today, because you would have this Rift window or Boon window where you're just smashing huge amounts of damage. The effects look the same as well, just how your animation is going out from your character, and you would just be hucking these blue meatballs at the enemy, doing tons and tons of damage, and then you'd have the explosion out of your own character rather than the Rift explosion on the target, which would also do even more damage out on top of that. So Boon was a great time, but at the same time, it came at the cost of watering down all of our other abilities. And at the cost of watering down all those other abilities, it started making other things feel a lot less valuable. Taking that into Dragonflight, that problem basically got more and more exacerbated really over time. Thankfully, they finished Shadowlands being able to mix it up between using both the Venthyr and the Kyrian Covenant abilities. We got some variety out of Sepulchre. Some areas we use like Boon, some areas we use Mind Games. But going into Dragonflight, losing those Covenant abilities, or at least their strength, Mind Games got specifically nerfed for Discipline to like dissuade us from utilizing it. We just had so many abilities that were producing various amounts of healing. You had Schism as an active ability, and then you also had multiple charges of Mind Blast, and you had your Penance, and you had your Shadow or Death. There was more damage abilities than ever before at the beginning of Dragonflight, and the spec absolutely suffered for it. This is the part where like it's mainly bloat. When a spec has like so many abilities and they have to balance out all the power together, it really just results in things being really watered down. Sins of the Many, notably, I believe it was in Dragonflight, I'm pretty sure, got the point where the diminished damage that it did, actually it wasn't Dragonflight, it was at the beginning. So Sins of the Many has existed since BFA, and it would always reduce the amount of damage you dealt with more atonements. Technically, it existed in Legion, but it actually did the opposite, where the more atonements you had, the more damage you did. BFA, they changed it so that it was going to give you more damage with lower atonements. In Dragonflight, they had also changed it so that it did not diminish in damage until you applied past 5 targets. And so once you went past those 5 targets, basically when you left the 5-man dungeons, then it would start reducing your damage, reducing your atonement healing, and so forth. This is an interesting area because this is when they really tried to fixate on 5-man healing for Dispriest and actually start focusing more on fixing the problem. This got pretty well saved by some of the like Covenant legendaries near the end of Shadowlands that really helped it a lot, giving you that cooldown reduction for your Covenant ability so you could actually blast. But it had been a very long, tedious, ongoing issue for the spec. And even though Season 2 of Dragonflight felt really, really good for just blasting tons of damage and producing good healing, it also was like probably the most complex version of the spec for M+, and very, very bloated. I'm sure some of you guys are going to say that you miss it, and I totally understand where you're coming from, but that was way too much button management just to actually produce damage, especially when you start comparing it to some of the times in the past as well, where like Smite actually just hit like a truck and produced great atonement healing. So halfway through going into Dragonflight, or halfway through Dragonflight, that's when we got the great pruning going on, merging your pet into your Shadow Covenant duration, merging Mind Blast and Schism into one ability with the same passive effects, trying to streamline the effects all together and get rid of some of the bloat in the process. This felt honestly pretty good, and it got even better as our Atonement healing in 5-man started feeling a lot better, but definitely the tuning knob of having your direct Atonement healing being increased in a 5-man environment became a crucial sort of like tuning point for us of feeling good or feeling bad in a dungeon. In a raid environment, the spec was like barely good enough, it felt. In Vault of the Incarnates to see play. In Aberrus, it disappeared entirely from gameplay. Very few people were playing disc and prog environments in like the Hall of Fame, for example. And it made its great comeback after the rework going into Season 3, which also was really heavily dependent upon the tier set bonus of having, during your Shadow Covenant duration, the extra hits out of Smite while you're in Shadow Covenant, giving you the additional cooldown reduction and sort of feeding into this loop of not only being a ramp healer, but also being more of a pet-based healer, relying on your damage abilities to reduce the cooldown of your pet, to activate your Shadow Covenant, and the pet damage to burst tons of healing. This has definitely been, I think it's fair to say it's a controversial rework, but I think a lot of Disc Priests like it as they've changed the game in general to give you more haste at the start of expansions. If they had this where like the beginning of BFA, you had effectively like 12 or 15% haste or something tiny like that, we would all be hating our lives. But actually getting haste at the beginning of the expansion so we can get those Shadow Covenant timers to where we need them to be, that does feel a lot better. Even though the spec still is struggling with a lot of mobility, which historically feels like it's been its niche. Kind of gets worse than ever, I would argue, going into like the War Within with how ridiculous time spiral and like heavy movement abilities are. And that's why like playing Disc and Anzarek, for example, has been really, really challenging. And it was like probably the most challenging boss fight I'd ever played Disc on in the like, I don't know, 11, 12 years that I've played it, because you are feeling like you're more dependent on other people's mobility increases, spatial paradox, or rescues if you get them. I didn't have any of those on our kill. And the precise positioning to plant your feet, set up your healing properly, and then be able to blast. On that fight, I had no spatial, rescue, or blessing of spell warding, or any of that kind of stuff to help with my mobility. And so the struggle really became of like, how do I set up my healing properly for all of these moments and make sure I'm not going to die in the process? Because if one thing has been true throughout all the history that I played Disc is that once you kind of get to a point where you've mastered how you want to set up your healing, it's also making sure you don't turbo feed. And there's definitely, we could probably make an entire video dedicated to my raiding experiences of like turbo feeding and learning to overcome that and working on my own progression as like a raider to make sure that didn't happen anymore. But that's another topic. That being said, that's kind of reached us to the War Within, where the independent tuning modifier of having Atonement being increased in a 5-man environment has made the spec the best in the M+ meta at the moment. You have a really sick Void Weaver talent, which is very similar to Boon of the Ascended, turning your Smite into a Void Blast. Your Penance empowers your Rift that you create out of your Mind Blast, so your Mind Blast does damage, increases damage taken on the target, and gives you cooldown reduction for your pet, and causes your pet to trigger an additional attack and extend the duration of Shadow Covenant. So the bloat has moved to passive effects rather than to active effects, but now all our abilities do like 5 different things, but it's still quite a bit of fun, especially since you don't need to have a perfect mastery, I would say, of like knowing every single passive. You got to know, hey, what order do you hit them in and how do you use it with really the rest of your kit? So I got to tell you, this feels like peak 5-man Disc Priest to me over the years. Raiding though, I really do feel like I miss BFA a lot. I miss not having as many modifiers, but I guess Essences ended up being another modifier that we had to juggle. I do miss when you didn't have anything sort of changing your Smite, and your Smite always felt good. We kind of got into this in like Shadowlands, where your Smite just started feeling weak because of how the changes to your kit have really come over time. And I kind of miss when just Smite was Smite, and it just hit hard, gave good value, even made those little mini absorbs like the Sanctuary talent does, but we don't take that anymore. But what can I say? It's it's honestly weird looking back at all this stuff over all the years, but I wouldn't trade it for anything, you know? The spec is like really what got me locked into healing forever, from the point where I got into PTR, made a priest, and was playing with like Halo and Cascade and Divine Star, and the bright numbers and the swirls and sparkles and stuff really stuck with me, you know? And I love it. And I hope you guys do as well. If I miss things, I know I miss things. There's so much in this game. Talk to me about your favorite memories with Disc over the years. What you enjoyed, what you don't enjoy. I'd love to hear it. Love to have you guys share it with me as well. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it. Let me know if you're interested in more of these little history of, because I had a blast making it. Thank you guys.